All right, we're back with Lloyd's podcast, episode 2. This topic for today's discussion is Black freedom and, more importantly, Black freedom of speech. And I have a special guest. Do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. My name is Daquan Burgess. I am Vice President of Contracts at BAE Systems, and by trade, I'm a lawyer. My specialty in school was tax and real estate. However, as a professional, I specialize in government contract law.
All right, great. So, right off the bat, what does Black freedom mean to you?
Black freedom, it's interesting. That's a great question. Black freedom to me, when we step back, in reality, it should represent the same as all freedoms afforded under the Constitution of the United States. So if you think of all the articles that make up the Constitution, whether it's the right to vote, the right to bear arms, those freedoms should be afforded to all Black people, but also the freedoms afforded to us, whether it's by the Bible or whatever spiritual being one subscribes to. And so the freedom to worship, the freedom to express one's thoughts openly, etc. The reason that I hesitate to answer the question outright is because I think over time, it's always been a relative comparison. And so what I mean by that is black people as a race always seem to have lagged in obtaining the same freedoms or relative freedoms of our Caucasian counterparts. But in my mind, when I think of Black freedoms, it should be the same freedoms that are afforded, whether through our spiritual beliefs or through the Constitution of the country that we reside in. But in reality, they've always been relative or to a lesser extent.
Of those two, yeah. I actually, before leading up to this, if you actually Google Black freedom as its own separate idea, the first thing that comes up is the Black freedom movement of the, I think it was 1940s to mid to late 1960s. So I always, when I thought of Black freedom, I would just think straight Emancipation Proclamation and beyond. I didn't really think about the Civil Rights Movement being named the Black freedom movement. And I thought that was just a really powerful term to call it, because I was never taught in school it was called the Black freedom movement. I was always taught Civil Rights Movement, MLK, Malcolm X, and you just aren't taught all of those specifics of it. It kind of gets glossed over.
Yeah. I one of the reasons I think that probably for me didn't resonate as a it's. I often look at like the civil rights movement as it's a snapshot in time. But if we think about our very existence today, we're always in a continual sort of movement to obtain freedoms by which we really should be guaranteed almost. And so if you think about it, you have the civil rights movement, you have the Black Power movement, you have the Black Lives Matter movement, right? They're all different, I think, demonstrations or appeals for recognition that we're still relatively behind the freedoms that are granted to others.
That's true.
And so, while they may have had, I think, notable leaders, right, whether it's civil rights, and it could be anybody from Congressman John Lewis to Martin Luther King to others, each movement may have had a particular focus, but it's something, when you look at it, it's still a present indicator of disparities in Black freedom that we still don't enjoy to the fullest extent. There's clearly a disparity. You could apply it to the justice system, freedom of speech, job rights, voting rights, etc.
Okay. Going off of that idea of just Black freedom as it is, do you think that our Black freedom is being taken for granted? And do you think that we could be using it in better ways or use it to its fullest potential? Or do you think we're still kind of, it's only been 50, 60 years since the civil rights movement. So I guess that there is still more to get out of it per se. But do you think that we're using it the best we can?
I would say no.
Okay.
I think there are some leading indicators that would suggest that we are not using the freedoms even afforded to us to the maximum extent possible. One leading indicator is voter turnout, right? So the 13th Amendment granted all citizens the right to vote, and so one of the lowest levels of turnout exists within the Black community. When you think of the right to education, we still remain one of the most underrepresented groups when it comes to education levels in some respects. Mm-hmm. I also look at, when we look at like home buyers, when we look at, distribution of wealth, I think there's a lot of opportunities and things that we can do better and differently. And so I don't think we're maximizing, even though I still think that there are relative ceilings as to how much freedoms as a people we obtain and have access to. Mm-hmm. I still don't think as a people we're maximizing those opportunities and potentials which are already afforded.
Okay, that's a good point about our voter rights, because it was, I think, during the 2008 election where like Black turnout was at its highest, mm-hmm. right? And that swung the election right there. Mm-hmm. More so was 2016 closer of a race than 2008? Not 2016, I'm sorry, 2012.
So 2012 would have been... that
was Romney.
That would have been Mitt Romney, so that would have been Obama's second... that would have been his he was running for a second term, right? Yeah. And so the numbers, Obama had an electrifying effect to be able to get record numbers of people both registered to vote and exercising the right to vote. Mm-hmm. And I think it's largely because people could resonate with President Barack Obama as a candidate, but also as a human being that looked like us. Mm-hmm. I think post-Obama, I think the Black community may have largely fell into a depression. It was a bittersweet goodbye when he departed the White House, and I think we as a people may not have continued to ride the momentum that he put in place, recognizing that the candidates didn't necessarily look like us, but also you had two candidates, and again, this is my political opinion, mm-hmm. that represented, I think, different levels of distrust, different levels of not being able to relate. And so in many respects, many political pundits would have considered or categorized those two candidates as who's the lesser of the two evils.
You hear that
but there wasn't a lot of, I think, charge and direct sort of accountability for Black people as a whole to get out and vote.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah. As a lawyer, do you think that Black people's freedom of speech in particular differs from white people's freedom of speech? So moving away from the broad idea of Black freedom to a more specific idea of freedom of speech. Yeah. So
what I would say again is I think it is still a disparity. And mm-hmm. so, I'll sort of bring it to the corporate workplace. 22 years working in a corporate environment, I cannot always, or I don't always feel at liberty to express my true unfiltered thoughts in the same way that my Caucasian counterparts or white male counterparts would be able to do so. Mm-hmm. I always have to filter my thoughts because daily I feel like my job is twofold. It's to deliver what the organization is paying me to do, but it's also to look around the room and recognize that nobody looks like me. And so therefore it has taken all of these many years. My company has been in existence for almost 100 years. And I look around and I'm the only vice president. So therefore, My role is to keep the door open and not close the door. So the wrong thing coming from me, a black male, could represent to my white male counterparts that I am wanting to bring up issues that they're not ready to discuss. Issues of race, issues of disparity, issues of succession for others that look like me. Largely, let's be clear, this country is not largely to embrace the idea that racism still exists. In many respects, when you look at the court system, cases of discrimination are not one. Cases of retaliation are one, because people are able to humanize and say, this person complained about this, and so therefore we can understand how people may have responded. But on the very premise of discriminating against one on the basis of color is something that the country is not largely embracing. As it relates specifically to free speech in the open sort of environment, I would say that there's still a barrier. When a black person speaks, whether it's on an issue of politics, finance, the economy, foreign affairs, military affairs, one still has to get beyond their presence, their tone, their diction, their just the superficial things in that particular environment before they're able to be judged based upon the substance of what they're saying. It's a barrier that doesn't exist with white counterparts. Somebody sizes up a white man when he opens his mouth to discuss these different topics and says, he's a big guy. He's coming across aggressively. He's a, he uses a sharp tone. He has a condescending way.
You don't get those little critiques.
You don't.
Like you do with African
And
Americans.
so as an African American man or woman, you have to get beyond those in any conversation setting or any speech setting before one takes your content seriously. Mm-hmm. And so in essence, you could be in a 5-minute speech, you could be 3 minutes in before someone's actually paying attention, or the large audience is paying attention to the content of what you're saying.
Yeah, just off of how you look. Yeah,
correct.
And you have to build a reputation with them off the bat. Well, compared to white people in particular, they can kind of just say what they need to say, and everyone's are paying attention right away.
Let's be clear. There are certain things that I can say, right, mm-hmm. but it could alienate people, which ultimately that's not the objective, right? I want to get folks to embrace me as a person, mm-hmm. which is necessary before they'll be able to respect my content. My white counterparts don't necessarily have that. I'm not going to say it's in all instances, but largely they don't share that experience. And so, again, in the vein of free speech, there's also a disparity. Let's be candid. We all have biases. However, when you look at black people, there's always an additional hurdle that we have to get beyond.
Yeah, that's a good point. At what point do you think that we will catch up, in a sense, to our white counterparts in freedom of speech? Or if you think we never will, and it'll just be a continuous thing of always getting so close, and you know what I mean? Because I'm young, so I kind of grew up in the Obama era with things being pretty progressive as it mm-hmm. is, and the LGBT movement has always been around mm-hmm. as far as I can remember. So mm-hmm. I can't say too much about it, but mm-hmm. As far as I know, things have been pretty good mm-hmm. and they've been continuing to trend forward. But just as what would you think about that?
So let's just be clear, right? I mean, I recognize, growing up in the Obama era, things seem pretty progressive, right? But I would remind you, I was born in the Carter era, right? Okay. So predominantly grew up in the Reagan era. Mm-hmm. And then, after Reagan was Bush the first, and then, of course, the Clinton days. Mm-hmm. So the Clinton days, by the time we got to the Clinton days, I was a young soldier in the U.S. Army. And so, as it relates to LGBT at the time, it was don't ask, don't tell. Well, many people perceive those as freedoms, but many people may not understand that created a lot of chaos for a lot of people in the LGBT community, because it was another way to incriminate someone based upon something other than the content of their character. It was about, what they were doing in their own private lives.